By the time Let It Be was released in 1970, the Beatles were no longer a band. What the world heard as a triumphant farewell album was, in truth, the sound of a family falling apart. The smiles in the photos, the warmth in the melodies. They hid the frustration, silence, and distance that had consumed the group. John Lennon, who once called the Beatles a prison, was already half gone, mentally and musically. He had fallen deeply into his own creative world with Yoko Ono. The sessions for Let It Be were chaotic, cold, and joyless. Yet even in that mess, one song stood out. A song John later admitted was the best thing on the record. That song was Let It Be. Paul McCartney said Let It Be came to him in a dream. One night while the band was at their lowest, Paul dreamt of his late mother, Mary, the woman who had always told him to stay calm, to believe that things would work out. In the dream, she told him, "It will be all right. Let it be." When Paul woke up, he turned that comforting phrase into a melody, a hymn for the hopeless. But when he brought it to the studio, the others weren't exactly inspired. George Harrison and Ringo Starr were patient, but John Lennon was detached, barely participating. The sessions had become mechanical. Arguments over arrangements, over Yoko's presence, over control. Still, Paul pressed on. And what emerged from that storm was one of the most moving, universal songs ever written. A plea for peace in a band that could no longer find it. Years later, in a rare moment of reflection, John Lennon was asked what he thought of Let It Be. He laughed, called the sessions a miserable experience, and said the album should have been left on the shelf. But then he paused, and admitted something unexpected. The best thing on it was Let It Be. That was Paul's. Beautiful song. I always liked it. It was a small statement, but a meaningful one. Coming from Lennon, who was often dismissive of Paul's more emotional songs, that was high praise. He had criticized Hey Jude for being too long and called Yesterday Paul's thing, not mine. But Let It Be struck a different chord. It wasn't sentimental for the sake of it. It was spiritual. It carried a message Lennon himself understood. Acceptance in the face of chaos. By 1969, the creative gap between John and Paul was wider than ever. John's writing had become raw, avant-garde, confessional. Songs like Don't Let Me Down or Cold Turkey bared his soul. Paul, on the other hand, was searching for beauty and simplicity, melodies that offered comfort in the middle of disarray. When he sang Let It Be at the piano, his voice carried both hope and heartbreak. He wasn't just singing to his mother, he was singing to his band, to his fans, and maybe even to John. Let it be. Let the fighting stop. Let the music speak. John could sense that. And while he didn't play a major role in the recording, he recognized its emotional truth. He later said that while Let It Be wasn't his kind of song, he respected its purity. For someone like Lennon, who distrusted sentimentality, that was the ultimate compliment. The irony of Let It Be is that it became the Beatles' final anthem of unity, even though it was recorded in total division. When Phil Spector later added his orchestral layers, something Paul disliked, the song took on an even grander, almost gospel tone. It was no longer just a Beatles song, it was a hymn for the end of an era. John once said in an interview, "Paul always had that optimism, that feeling that things would get better. I didn't have that. That's why it worked between us." In that sense, Let It Be captured exactly what made Lennon and McCartney such a powerful partnership. Paul was the light, idealistic, structured, melodic. John was the shadow, cynical, chaotic, and raw. Together they created balance. And even in their final days, that balance was reflected in Let It Be. Over time, Lennon's relationship with Beatles songs changed. He grew distant from some, proud of others, and indifferent to many. But when Let It Be played, he didn't argue with its message. He didn't call it fake or commercial. He simply acknowledged its beauty. In the 1970s, he told one journalist, "That's Paul. He did that one really well. I've always liked it. It's real." And coming from John Lennon, a man who rarely called anything real, that was saying something. Decades later, when Paul performed Let It Be live at charity events, tributes, and even the London Olympics, It became a global prayer for peace, for hope, for understanding. Even fans who didn't know the story behind it felt its meaning. And somewhere in the afterlife of their partnership, John Lennon's quiet praise still echoes. That was Paul's best one on the album, Beautiful Song. For a band torn apart by fame, ego, and exhaustion, Let It Be was the moment of grace that reminded the world, and maybe even the Beatles themselves, why they mattered in the first place. John might have dismissed many things the Beatles did near the end, but not this. Not Let It Be. Because even he knew, sometimes the only thing left to do is accept, forgive, and let it be.